In North Korea, despite the complete destruction of its infrastructure, Kim Il-sung quickly oversaw the complete transformation of his country and rebuilt it in his image.
After the end of the Korean War, the North Korean economy developed quite rapidly because they had a great deal of support from the Soviet Union and from Communist China.
Economic growth in North Korea through the 50s, after the Armistice, and really into the early 60s, was clearly greater than that of South Korea.
Kim Il-sung used the memory of the war to double down on his authority. In his rewriting of history, America and South Korea were the aggressors who instigated the war, and it was he who led North Korea to victory over American tyranny.
The way the North Koreans learned about the Korean War is that the United States, first of all, divided the Korean Peninsula, then invaded North Korea. But under the great leadership of Kim Il-sung, the North Koreans emerged victorious. Yet you have to continually fight against the Americans because Americans are bent on destruction of North Korea. And this is sort of repeated over and over and over.
After the war, Kim Il-sung was in a very vulnerable position because he led the country into this disaster. But Kim Il-sung is a survivor, and he then begins to consolidate his power, and then a huge purge happens in 58 and 59. Some people say like 100,000 people then are killed. By 61, he's totally in power.
미국이 전쟁을 일으켰고 그리고 김일성이가 그 전쟁을 승리로 이끈 전설적 지도자다. 이렇게 교육을 받았죠.
Before he defected to the South in 2004, Jang Jin-sung was a prominent member of the North Korean propaganda wing and was raised under the influence of Kim Il-sung.
수령은 당연히 신이고 그리고 주민은 무조건 복종해야 된다. 이것을 당연시했죠. 북한 주민들이 정서와 생각, 의식 이런 감성 독재에 북한 주민들을 가두는 것이죠. 두 가지 정서, 다시 말해서 충성 정서와 또 적에 대한 중업이 필요한 것이죠. 북한은 미국에 대해서 북한은 그 정권 차원에서 3대 주족을 규정했어요. 그러니까 미국, 일본, 남한인 거죠.
Though he was increasingly isolated, Kim Il-sung's vision for his country remained true. To build an army strong enough to defend itself from America and South Korea, and to one day unify the peninsula. By 1968, South Korea had emerged from the era of corruption and economic stagnation that had marred Syngman Rhee's administration. Under the leadership of General Park Chung-hee, a military leader with an eye towards modernity, South Korea's economy was booming.
By the late 1960s and early 70s, Park Chung-hee implemented an export-oriented economy, and it was through his guidance that South Korea, as we know it, really began to take off economically. I mean, he was also a dictator, but he was able to create the economic platform from which South Korea could then develop into a democracy. As South Korea started to take off economically, North Korea then saw the window for reunification closing because it had surpassed North Korea's economy. North Korea was going down economically, South Korea was going up.
With thousands of American troops sitting on its border and a well-armed South Korean military, Kim Il-sung saw his opportunities to unite the peninsula under his own control shrinking by the day.
Between 1967 and 1972, it did look like that North Koreans really wanted to restart hostilities and maybe create havoc by successful assassinations of high-level officials. So a short period, which is sometimes called the Second Korean War, began.
And it was at that point that North Korea then begins a series of provocative actions in order to unify the peninsula under Kim Il-sung's rule.
On January 21st, 1968, Kim Il-sung ordered his most brazen military operation since the signing of the 1953 Armistice. A unit of highly trained North Korean commandos cut their way through barbed wire along the demilitarized zone and snuck into the south. Donning South Korean military uniforms and credentials, the commandos stormed the Blue House, the private residence of President Park Chung-hee. The commandos' orders, which came directly from Kim Il-sung, were concise and explicit.
Their instructions were basically to go to the Blue House, to kill the South Korean president, Park Chung-hee, to cut off his head and to bring it back to North Korea.
Somehow, the North Koreans got within yards of the president before they were discovered, and the assassination was thwarted.
And I sincerely hope Kim Il-sung and his people up north recognize the futility and the unwisdom of continuing this action.
But just days later, North Korea captured the USS Pueblo, which had been sailing off the coast of Korea. The 82-man crew was transported to Pyongyang, where they were charged as spies. For 11 months, the ship's crew was tortured and subjected to harsh interrogations.
The North Koreans committed yet another wanton and aggressive act by seizing an American ship and its crew. Clearly, this cannot be accepted.
There was no peace accord, and the timing couldn't be worse. In January 1968, US troops were now off to war in Vietnam.
The Pueblo incident kind of illustrates the dilemma that the Americans have always been in, because we do have major interests in Korea, but we have global interests as well. So the Americans were deeply engaged in Vietnam and were scared to death that Park Chung-hee would take some kind of action that would create a renewed Korean War.
Park Chung-hee is furious. He wants to go north. He wants to seek revenge for the Blue House raid. But all the other powers around the Korean Peninsula, of course, are not interested in restarting the Korean War. The Americans are bogged down in Vietnam. The Soviet Union has distractions in Eastern Europe. It invades Czechoslovakia in 1968. And the Chinese are involved in their Cultural Revolution. So the outside powers outside of the Korean Peninsula have no interest in starting the Korean War.
With pressure from America, Korean President Park stood down. The American crew of the Pueblo were released in December 1968. The USS Pueblo was never returned.
There was a Cold War competition between the North and the South that was quite intense. Lots of hostilities day to day along the border. And I think it's fair to say that every time in that history, whenever we saw the South Koreans doing something good, the North Koreans would always seek to spoil that party.
Throughout the next 2 decades, there was to be much friction between the two Koreas. But at the end of the 80s, with all eyes on Seoul, the conflict would take on a new form, that of terrorism.
The Seoul Olympics in 1988 was a major turning point. That's the time when South Koreans and the rest of the world felt that, well, South Korea is way ahead.
These games were widely seen worldwide as a triumph of the South Korean anti-communist regimes. And, well, North Koreans wanted to spoil the show.
In November of 1987, just weeks before South Korea was to hold its first democratic elections and was busily preparing for the Olympic Games, 2 North Korean agents working under orders from the Kim regime planted a bomb aboard Korea Air Flight 858. All 104 passengers and 11 crew members were killed.
the Republic of Korea has produced evidence that KAL 858 was destroyed by an act of terrorism by North Korea.
This bombing of the Korean Airlines plane was just a part of their efforts to create a climate of fear to prevent people from going to the Seoul Olympic Games.
But the desperate act of terror by Kim Il-sung backfired.
It's at that point that really you can say the Korean War has been won by South Korea.
The world to Seoul, Seoul to the world.
And then Soviet Union establishes diplomatic relations with South Korea in 1990. China follows in 1992. So North Korea is now diplomatically isolated, humiliated by the Seoul Olympics, and unable to deal with South Korea on any equal terms. And it's that time then that the North Korean regime seeks its nuclear program for its own security.
Kim Il-sung would never see the fruits of his nuclear research program. He died of a heart attack on the 8th of July, 1994. Ordinary North Koreans were forced into a state of prolonged mourning.
김일성이 죽었을 때는 그 전체주의 눈물이어야 했어. 3년 동안 그런 추모 분위기를 강요당해야 했던 것이죠. 그러니까 그 3년 안에 무슨 술을 마시거나 그리고 웃거나 이런 행위는 거의 불법으로 반역 행위처럼 그렇게 규정이 되어 있었어요. 그러나 최소한 제 주변의 사람들은 김일성도 죽는구나. 신도 죽는구나. 그도 인간이었구나. 그리고 좀 희망을 가지게 됐었죠. 이렇게 우리가 체제가 변할 수도 있지 않겠는가. 이런 조심스러운 희망들을 가질 수 있었습니다.